What a week we've had in the news. Power and influence is on display everywhere at the moment. Politics, war, boardrooms. And too often the headlines shows what happens when it's used to protect ego or profit instead of people. Even just looking at the last week, if I mention the word Venezuela, Grok on X, it's frightening what people are using their power for. But then we have consoling stories such as that of the First Lady, Brigitte Macron, winning her case for being cyberbullied by 10 people in France. It'll be interesting to see how her court case does against a massive influencer in the States in the coming year. In this faith and business conversation, we look at power and influence in responsible leadership, but this session specifically focuses on the dangers and responsibilities of power, how it can distort judgment, damage the vulnerable, and yet held under God, become a gift for service rather than a weapon for self-interest. I would encourage you to participate. Think of questions you might want to ask people, and I will moderate the discussion after the three speakers. So if you can put a capital Q in the chat before your question, I will be able to pick those out from any comments you might drop in the chat. I'm introducing Harvey to speak first. Harvey is a transformational consultant who helps organizations achieve a people-first approach to delivering high performance with ease. He also helps run Christian business leaders in Oxfordshire and the Cotswolds. But to save Harvey having to hand over to Nick, let me introduce him too. After Harvey, Nick will speak. He's a director of advocacy at the Economics of Mutuality Alliance, where he works to promote business practices that benefit people and the environment. Having studied history, politics, and theology, he has over 10 years' experience in strategic communications with organizations that include Tearfund. But first, passing over to you, Harvey, and looking forward to what you have to say.
Thanks, Fiona. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be able to share some thoughts with you today. And when I come to the theme for today, the dangers of power, the quote I always think of is the one that goes, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And I'm sure from the news items Fiona highlighted, other examples that we've come across, both contemporary and in the Bible, we've seen this to be true. And alongside that, I love what Peter Parker's uncle says when Peter discovers his abilities as Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. Very much what I think Jesus is referring to in the parable of the talents, when he says, "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded." And what I want us to consider today is how much our deepest assumptions about how a business ought to look and work actually impact how we think about how we use that power, and whether the model of business that I suspect most of us have grown up with might actually be unhelpful in this regard. And for some context, my wrestling with this question came in the late 1980s and 90s. I was working in the car industry for Rover Group at the time, when we were seeking to learn from the methods that had made the Japanese so successful. And as well as introducing a lot of technical aspects, it encouraged us to think of a very different way of leading. And as a Christian, I found myself asking myself the question, how is it that this way of leading from a culture that is essentially coming from a Shinto Buddhist perspective actually seems a lot more like what I see Jesus teaching in the Bible than this business model that I've kind of grown up with in a supposedly Christian country? And exploring that question has shaped much of my subsequent career, both my later years in the automotive industry and for the last 20 years as an independent consultant, both studying what the Bible teaches and learning more about this Japanese approach that we now refer to as lean management, and how the two interacting have inspired and informed my view. And to put that in some context, perhaps I should explain what I think about in terms of the a typical Western approach to business. And I'm going to put a slide up because I think a picture perhaps explains it more clearly. And I think our Western view is very much about starting from a position that business is about making money. And in a lot of cases, profit is everything. Which in some senses brings us into an area where we're into a very directive leadership style, where it's very much about the senior leaders telling people what to do, a level of command and control. Therefore, people are seen as a resource, a means of achieving that purpose. And if we look at the world today, a lot of that in our context very much leads to short-term thinking and action. And as Christians, we might think, oh, we're more enlightened than that. And we see a lot of moves away from this sort of command and control type culture to more caring styles. And yet I find myself wondering whether, I don't know what I just did there. I find myself wondering whether we are still hugely influenced by this model about how a business should work. And is there in some of the studying I've done an alternative model that might be more helpful? And this was really brought home to me at the end of 2024 when I had the chance to actually visit Japan for the first time and see some of these organizations firsthand. Because if I take a view that is lean thinking, whereas I think our Western model is very much about work is done, something I do for the benefit of me or my organization. A lean thinking way would say work is actually something that is done for the benefit of others. And that transfers to the organization too. And very much coming from a much longer term, multi-generational view of the goal and purpose of business and its care for the people in it. In that sense, and what I experienced very much on the Japan visit is people are seen as a treasure to be valued, nurtured, developed, far more than a resource or an asset to be exploited, which naturally leads to a much more servant-oriented idea. And there's no mistake that I've built this model from the bottom up, because it's built very much on an inverted pyramid model where the leaders are seen to successively support those in the next tier of activity to deliver what they need to deliver for the organization and for themselves. And that's built around a much grander purpose and a very different view of money and profit. One of the organizations we visited, the founder of that one, even goes so far as say profit is excrement, not meaning that it's not good, but profit is a natural outcome of an otherwise healthy business. And actually there is a better idea of what business is about in terms of developing people. He would say in the same sense, our purpose as a business is to bring happiness to our people. And others would say a good company is one that is well regarded by all those that interact with it and contributes to its community and to society. So very, very much a different model. And when I lay that alongside what I think Jesus teaches, Jesus talks about seek first the kingdom of God, long-term thinking. He talks about primarily our role is to love the Lord our God, to love our neighbor as ourselves, and therefore very much people focused. Very much talks about contrasts what he describes as the Gentile view of leadership with a much more servant-oriented style. And in the end, Jesus is calling us, I think, to bring the kingdom into the communities that we work in. So, having considered those two models, I wonder how those two models actually might inform our thinking about how we use power. And leaving you with that thought, I'm now going to pass over to Nick for his thoughts.
Thank you, Harvey, and it's a real pleasure to be with everyone today. It's my first time at one of these gatherings, so thank you for welcoming me. Yeah, I was reflecting on this topic and thinking about examples from the Bible of leaders that have represented the dangers and responsibilities of power. And I thought it might be helpful to bring a couple of case studies to you today of two very different individuals in very different contexts, exercising their power and falling foul of their power in certain ways under very different circumstances. So I've chosen Saul and Esther. I'm assuming that people are fairly kind of versed in the stories of these two characters. And as I only have 6 minutes, I'm not going to give any kind of biographical overview. But I just want to pick out some key points for each of them and make sure that I don't go over time. Let me just make a note of the time here. So Saul in chapters 9 to 15 of 1 Samuel represents formal authority, role-based leadership. He's appointed legitimately. He's got this public validation as well as spiritual endorsement. And he's a leader who starts well but deteriorates under pressure. And we can learn from him certain dangers of power. We see fear of losing status overriding his obedience. He obeys selectively to maintain approval. A modern parallel might be pleasing stakeholders or board members or markets at the expense of values. And I think we often see this with companies that might start out with good intentions, a purpose that benefits broader society and doesn't harm the environment. But actually, we sometimes see these companies getting bigger and ownership becomes more diverse. And suddenly, profit maximization, to kind of circle back to one of Harvey's points, becomes the goal and the values are lost. In the story of Paul, we also see power becoming defensive, where decisions are driven by image management, not truth. We see blame shifting and justification replacing accountability. We see insecurity increases actually as Saul's power consolidates. The more he clings to authority, ironically, the more fragile his position becomes. And he tries to replace trust with control. And often we see spiritual language masking ethical compromise. He reframes disobedience as religious intent, talks about forced sacrifice. And today, how often do we see this? Ethical shortcuts justified as necessary for the business. And we see greenwashing, purpose washing, language that makes out as though businesses and leaders are doing the right thing, but actually they're masking other motivations. So where does that leave us in terms of responsibilities as Christian leaders today? We need to understand leadership as stewardship, not ownership. Authority is entrusted temporarily, not possessed permanently. We need to choose faithfulness over popularity. God values obedience more than results or optics. We have to create space for truth tellers. Saul's downfall accelerates because he resists correction. And finally, we have to hold power lightly. Leaders who cannot imagine life beyond their role are most vulnerable to misuse of power. So moving on to Esther, we see the responsibility of influence without formal authority. So in chapters 4 to 7 in particular, we see that Esther represents relational and moral influence rather than positional control, as we see with Saul. Her power is exercised within constraints, and she's leading from the margins. Mordecai reframes influence as moral calling. In chapter 4, verse 14, he says, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" A very well-known phrase and a really fascinating phrase that makes us think about God's sovereignty as we live out our lives of leadership. So what are the dangers of influence that we can learn from this story then and now? We see silence for the sake of safety as a danger. Esther's initial instinct is self-preservation. And actually when influence is unused, is influence squandered. Another danger is underestimating one's own power. Esther doesn't initially see her role as morally decisive. And today, many leaders or many professionals, many individuals in career contexts dismiss their influence because they lack a title. And we also have a danger of confusing neutrality with innocence. Silence does not equal faithfulness. So what about responsibilities for Christian leaders today? I think we need to recognize influence as vocation. For such a time as this, reframes career and position and helps us to see things very differently. I think we have to accept the cost of moral courage. Responsible influence involves personal risk. We must use relational wisdom, not force. Esther acts strategically, patiently, and courageously. And we must speak when silence enables injustice. God's purposes move forward, but individuals are still accountable for their response. So what we see in this story is influence bringing responsibility, even when it offers no protection. And just to circle back to Saul to finish off, what we see there is when leaders cling to power, they lose the very authority they are trying to protect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was over to me now, but what an act to follow. And I love how you've ended with Esther, because it segues very nicely in some ways into what I'm going to say. So have you ever had an impossible leadership position? One that has so much power, but you feel utterly powerless as you drown under the weight of responsibility? Where the fake it till you make it maxim could cost lives, or at least the welfare of others. Have you ever worked under someone like that? Have you ever depended on that person for your growth and development? Has that strange mix of power and powerlessness ever been you? I'm speaking of the invisible voice in the workplace and every organization that has ever existed, from farming to senior government. She is the mother. Whether you proceeded by stay at home, working, or single. Don't you think we carry that internal voice into the workplace, and it influences how we show up? If the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, a proverb that became famous from a poem written by a man in 1865. If this hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, the mother's voice is definitely worthy of our consideration in this Faith and Business series. Its power and influence on all of us, for good or evil, is definitely worth considering in the work world and in faith in business. Who here has not been impacted by the influence of their own mother? Impacted by becoming a parent themselves, and the role your partner has played in your ability to show up fully at work. Let's consider the mother's voice in a business context under a theme of power and influence, and on the dangers and responsibilities of power. If the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, consider with me a passage from Romans 13, and I'm taking it from verse 3. We were given this today as our key passage. Just think about in relation to a mother. If rulers hold no terror for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Have any of us really considered the influence they or we, since I'm one of them, have? I recently discovered when compiling a maternal ancestry for the next generation that I come from a long line of resilient Irish women in records that stretch back to the 1800s. From farming backgrounds to grocers, victuallers, auctioneers, and publicans, they birthed up to 12 children, not all surviving, and most were widowed and left to run homes and businesses, partially as a result of marrying men 20 years their senior. I'm sure the power of the Roman Catholic Church both helped and hindered them. My own mother was the sixth of 7 children born to my grandmother, and final child of a loving family and community before marrying in her 30s. My dad was only 3 years older than her, incidentally. She was an adored and adoring wife and business partner for a mere 18 years before being tragically widowed. I genuinely wonder if she would have chosen to have children today. She drew delight from her husband and her work, but I believe she was overpowered by the quick appearance and demands of 3 daughters. My own career choices have been profoundly shaped by our deliberate decision to have 3 children, and the co-parenting has been an ongoing communication game and a job share. My children often heard me going, "I'm not shouting, I'm projecting." I share these personal segues for comparison, lest you think I've had more than the usual trauma in my upbringing and parenting, but also to illustrate that I'm representing women in business who have been given untold power in the home and influence their children without any qualifications to do so. The longest passage in the Bible about powerful and influential leadership is Proverbs 31. It covers home, business, and community, and is written by a woman, a mother, beginning, a woman of noble character who can find. She is worth more than rubies. Rubies are rare. I end with a favorite quote on the difference between power and influence from My Big Fat Greek Wedding. "Ma, Dad is so stubborn. What he says goes. The man is the head of the house." Let me tell you, Tula, the man is the head, but the woman, she's the neck, and the neck can turn the head any which way she pleases. A question I leave you with is, how can we ensure our faith in business acknowledges and incorporates the power and influence of mothers and their voice? That is our 3 speeches, our 3 talks, our 3 presentations for today. And we're now going to open up for our Q&A. I'm looking in the chat and there isn't a question so far. So please, if any of you have a question, unmute yourselves and ask away and say who you're particularly wanting to direct the question to, or all 3 of us can do that if required. We're going to each of us be highlighted now.
Thank you, Fiona. I have a question. I run a factory in Ghana, as many of you know, so I have 1,000 employees there. And what we set out to do was very much do that people first, people-centric style of leadership. What we've discovered is that the sense of entitlement is so strong in today's culture as well, that actually now we have a situation often where people expect that they're going to have certain benefits, treat certain way, to the point of we're not going to work or do what we want to do unless you give all of these things to us, and you're doing us a favor by employing us. So how do you get that balance between working together as an organization while still putting the people first within it?
Okay, so I'll share a thought on that one from what I've observed and experienced over the years, I guess, Karen, because I think when we first started changing the leadership style in Rover, and we switched from this what we had as command and control, we ended up with what almost became a very soft style of leadership. If Marjorie Mayer was here, she'd say it was a very nice leadership culture. So we kind of we felt we had to be nice to people, and therefore we lost this sense of holding people accountable. And I think the challenge is creating the right contract between leadership and the rest of the organization that says there are mutual expectations. And there's a great book by a lady called Kim Scott that some of you will have come across, called Radical Candor. And she highlights this model that says if people know we care about them, that gives us a lot more permission to challenge them in a way that is kind rather than controlling. And, at its simplest, I think it's going back to that. It says if people know we care, we can establish a better contract with them, because it's not about rolling over and being nice to everybody.
Thank you, Harvey. Nick, did you want to share a thought, or do we go over to Adrian, who's raised his hand?
Happy to move to the next question.
Sure. Thank you, Harvey. Adrian?
Yeah, mine isn't really, because just an observation comment, just following on from your reflection, Fiona, for which thanks very much, and thanks to the three of you. But yeah, since you were talking about mothers, it just struck me that there's that episode in the Bible, isn't there, where at the wedding at Cana, Mary says to Jesus, you need to help them out, they're in a difficult situation, and he says, my time has not yet come. So he's kind of off duty, but he still does it, and I guess he did it because she asked him to. So that's an example of a mother's influence shaping the situation. Just thought that might be helpful.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much. And I love that he says, my time has not yet come. And she turns to the service and she says, do whatever he tells you.
Yeah.
It took me some courage to decide. This was really on my heart to share, but I did a load of research after writing this, and the way a mother shapes the moral and ethical backbone of the children she raises who are going to go into the workplace is something I felt shouldn't be ignored. And also the question of, there are certain people in the world at the moment in leadership, and I just think what influence was going on there in parenting. And the mother's voice can be the benevolent one. So if it isn't, what does that lead to? And how can we respect and honor that in society? Have we got more questions, or would you like to go into the breakout rooms? I'm just going to give a moment for anyone to throw out a question, but I do want to leave you time to share.
Yeah, I think Stephen's put one in the chat, but I think that could be a very long discussion. Although he didn't put Q on the thing, Fiona, he's going, are we likely to transition back to a more traditional form? And I guess the question is, have we ever really got away from it? Although we think we have in pockets. And I think what we see happening now is people going back to this default, because abuse of power is the easiest option. We've, as Christians, we even fall into that with our kids and those who work for us, don't we? When it gets tough, we use the positional power that we've got, badly or not. And that's what I think we see happening. And I think our role, and I think that, to Stephen's point, the biblical model if you like, says we oughtn't to lead that way. That's not what Jesus calls us to do. And I think we have to be the countercultural voice in the way that Jesus was the countercultural voice of his time. You know, the sort of models I've learned from sort of looking at Bible and Japan in parallel, they're not comfortable, they're not easy, they're very unconventional. You know, even the great companies in Japan are countercultural, even in Japan. They just give us a different framework. And it's hard work.
That's interesting that they're actually countercultural in Japan too. So Karen has asked a question. Karen, would you like to ask this? Or shall I read it?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to ask it. I'm interested. Thank you. I think what you've all brought has been excellent this afternoon. One of my observations as a leadership coach, that's why I'm interested in your thoughts, is that often what gets in the way is fear. It's one of the most commonly used words in the Bible because God recognises we fall into the trap of fear. So the question really is, to what extent does fear hold leaders and followers back, which often comes from a lack of identity? In other words, working for approval, not from it. And I'm just interested to get your thoughts.
Thank you. I'd love Nick to start us off, considering his mention of this when he talked about Esther.
Absolutely. Do you mind if I also quickly just speak to Stephen's question, and then I could talk to Karen's as well?
Sure.
Just because I felt like I had a couple of relevant points for Stephen's. I think it's a really interesting question. Actually, and Harvey, you spoke about lean management and sort of developing in the 90s, and then since then, and particularly since the 2008 crash, we've seen a large number of different models kind of emerge, trying to respond to the kind of traditional Friedman school of profit maximization, and particularly, you know, in the time around the pandemic, kind of those years, and just before, there was about 5 years where companies were tripping over themselves to talk about how virtuous they were and how much they were doing for society and the environment, and responding to all the different kind of global challenges being faced, whether that's, you know, climate change or growing inequality, et cetera, et cetera. But then since the new administration in Washington, there's been a lot of rowback. And what's interesting, we found, and a lot of the companies we work with, a lot of the people that I speak to that work with companies around the world, is that those who were only ever kind of paying lip service to this better way of seeing and doing business quite happily have rowed back and defaulted to how they were doing things before. And actually those that really believed in it and where it was a genuine motivation, they're continuing to do it because it makes good business sense, and their leadership teams and their ownership and governance models are kind of aligned behind that vision. And actually, in some cases, particularly in the US, we see companies sticking to their guns, but not talking about it and actually keeping it under the radar. Whereas in the past, it was all about talking about it. Now it's happening underneath. So, yeah, I just wanted to say, I think that's just such a relevant point at the moment. And I think, you know, we can kind of see the wheat being sorted from the chaff, as it were.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Karen, thank you for your question. I mean, I think absolutely, you know, fear can really hold us back. And I think one of the key themes we see throughout the Bible, in whatever context we're called to lead, is to have courage, which is, I suppose, one of the opposites of fear. And Esther was called to courage, and I think the call that came to her was perhaps surprising. And Saul was called to have courage, and he faltered, whereas Esther stood strong and actually grew in her identity, as it were, in her calling. And I think calling is a huge part of that as well, isn't it? And we have that verse, that reference, for such a time as this. And it was as if the Lord manipulated circumstances, including preparing Esther for that moment where she could step up and cast fear aside, and equipped her with what she needed, in her own psychology, in her emotional life, I suppose, in the people around her, to be able to face fear and to be courageous and do the right thing in that moment.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm so conscious of the need for you all to have time in a breakout room to chew on this together. So I'm going to go to that.